The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the jagged edges of the prairie, turning the sky into a bleeding canvas of gold and rose. Dust rose in lazy spirals from the dry ground, catching the light and making the air shimmer as if the horizon itself were breathing. Silas McKenna moved toward the barn with measured steps, boots stirring small clouds, the quiet crunch of grit beneath them sounding louder than it should in the settling evening. He had walked this path countless times, yet tonight, something different lingered in the air, like a secret waiting to be unearthed. His chest carried the weight of solitude, the hollow ache left by years spent chasing cattle and ghosts, and by the memory of the father he had buried too young. He paused at the barn door, the rough wood worn smooth under his fingers, and listened. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, caught his attention. A quick shuffle, a breath too fast, a whisper of fear. Silas's eyes narrowed, scanning the shadows of the barn interior. There, huddled among the hay bales, was a young woman, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders like midnight, eyes wide and wary, holding herself as though she could vanish into the straw itself. Lila Redhawk. He had heard her name in whispered tales at the town's edge, the girl who had survived the scattering of her family and the harsh judgment of the world. She was barely 20, but she carried herself with a kind of careful dignity that only those who had been tested young could bear. "You shouldn't be here," Silas said, his voice low, almost a murmur but not unkind. The words seemed to hang between them like smoke, curling in the slanting light. Her gaze met his, sharp yet unsure, and he saw the flicker of both defiance and desperation. The barn smelled of dry hay, horses, and the faint trace of earth that clung to her boots, sense that somehow grounded him in the immediacy of her presence. She flinched slightly at his shadow moving closer, and he stopped, letting the silence stretch, letting her measure him as much as he measured her. "You'll stay," he whispered, voice roughened by the dust and wind. "Pack your belongings. You'll stay with me." He didn't offer explanations and she didn't demand them. The statement hung in the space between them like a fragile promise, fragile and urgent. Lila's hand trembled as she reached for the small bundle of clothes she had hidden beneath a bale of hay. Her eyes darted to the door, imagining the faces of the townsfolk, imagining the judgment that would fall on both of them if she stepped outside too soon. Silas watched quietly, noting each subtle motion, the way her fingers lingered on the coarse fabric, the way her eyes flicked to the fading light beyond the barn. No words were exchanged, and yet a silent accord formed. She would trust at least for now, and he would protect at least for now. Days passed, each one marked not by grand gestures but by small acts of attention and care. Silas left water and bread for her, simple things, yet laden with significance, watching her carefully as she consumed them with a quiet gratitude. Lila, in turn, began to leave traces of her life in the barn. A small feather pinned to a beam, a carved piece of wood left beside the water trough, gestures meant not to declare love, but to acknowledge a connection, fragile as the wind. Their proximity was electric yet understated. No grand confessions were necessary. Every brush of a hand against a rough surface, every glance exchanged across sunlit dust motes, carried weight. The town began to murmur as towns do, their judgments swift and unrelenting. Silas and Lila moved through their days as though carrying invisible chains, each day a small rebellion against the whispers. At first it was just glances, neighbors peering over fences, townsfolk muttering behind shuttered windows, but soon came the tangible threats. A bottle thrown too close to the barn door, hoofbeats that echoed with intent, words sharpened like knives. And yet, even in the face of this quiet hostility, Lila's gaze toward Silas softened in ways that spoke of trust growing from fear, of hope breaking through layers of caution. Silas, too, was changing, though he scarcely noticed at first. Loneliness had dulled his senses, made him see the world in shades of gray and dust. But in Lila's presence he felt color again. The blush of dawn on her cheeks, the simple curve of her smile, the way her hands worked with a patient precision. These small observations began to anchor him, to awaken a part of himself he had long thought lost. He began to notice the subtle shifts in her posture when she was calm versus when she was tense, learning to read the unspoken language of her survival. Nights were the most intimate. The barn, normally empty and echoing with the wind, now felt like a world unto itself, insulated from the judgments outside. They would sit on bales of hay, the cold air brushing through gaps in the boards, sharing moments of silence that were louder than any words. Silas taught her to ride, the reins heavy in their hands but their movements in harmony, as if the horses themselves sensed the burgeoning trust. Lila taught him to track, to notice the subtleties of footprints in dirt, the whisper of wind through the grass, lessons in patience and observation that mirrored the careful cultivation of their bond. One morning, the horizon breaking in gold and rose, Silus noticed Lila staring toward the distant mountains, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "What is it?" he asked softly, though he already understood that some answers lay beyond speech. I think of them," she said, voice barely above the whisper of wind through the barn. Her family, scattered and lost to her, shadows of memory she carried like a folded letter in her pocket. Silus placed a hand gently on her shoulder, grounding her in the present, offering the quiet assurance that she did not face the world alone. The tension mounted as the town's scrutiny intensified. A horseman rode near the barn's edge one afternoon, stopping just short of the gate, surveying the place as though it held secrets meant to be exposed. Silas's jaw tightened. He did not draw a weapon, did not shout, did not invite confrontation. Instead, he guided Lila to the rear of the barn, where the wind carried their whispered planning like a shield. Escape would come at first light, they agreed, not through violence but through patience, observation and courage tempered by necessity. By the following week, the couple had moved through countless quiet, careful rehearsals of departure, each step an act of trust, each glance a negotiation of fear and desire. And then at dawn, under a sky painted in trembling shades of lilac and amber, they performed a ritual that belonged to them alone. No one watched, and yet the world seemed to hold its breath. Silus carved their initials into a sturdy elm at the edge of the clearing, each stroke deliberate, each mark a promise. Lila tied a ribbon through his hair, a simple braid that carried meaning beyond words, a binding of presence and intention, of survival and love intertwined. They married quietly, not with pomp but with profound intimacy. The morning air was crisp, smelling of wet grass and sun-warmed earth. Their vows were whispered, like prayers cast into the wind, pledges of protection and presence, promises to uphold dignity and love in equal measure. The ceremony held no audience save for the wind, the faint call of a hawk, and the soft rustle of wildflowers brushing against one another. Tears came unbidden, laughter rippled gently, and the weight of past suffering lifted slightly, replaced by the fragile joy of mutual recognition. The storm that had threatened in distant rumble arrived only as a gentle reminder, the wind bending the wildflowers at the edges of their clearing. They mounted their horses, hands entwined, and rode through the morning mist, the horizon opening wide before them. Silus glanced at Lila, the early light catching the hope glinting in her eyes, and felt the quiet swell of a life worth the trials they had endured. Lila, in turn, felt the firm weight of his hand around hers, a tether to the present, to possibility, to dignity restored. They rode on, neither speaking, for words would have spoiled the perfection of their shared silence. The prairie stretched infinitely around them, golden under the rising sun, a reminder that the world, vast and unfeeling, could still be claimed in moments of grace and courage. And in that quiet communion, they understood that the acts of care, the gestures of trust, the patient cultivation of connection, these were the threads of life, stronger than fear, louder than judgment, more enduring than solitude. Sometimes, the wind carries echoes of what was lost, and sometimes the earth remembers the steps we take, even when no one watches. Silus and Lila would carry their scars as all people do, but they would also carry each other, the fragile promise of tenderness, the small grace of presence in a world too often harsh. And for the first time, both knew that loneliness could be overcome not by grand gestures, but by the quiet constancy of care, the patient cultivation of trust, and the courage to allow one heart to meet another in the space between fear and hope. And so, as the sun climbed higher, painting the plains with light, the barn behind them faded into shadow, and the horizon ahead opened wide, infinite and waiting. Their story would continue not in headlines or whispers, but in the steady rhythm of life shared, of moments chosen, of love, cautious and deliberate, growing like grass through cracks in the hard earth. And if you listen closely, the prairie itself seems to murmur, a gentle reminder that even in hardship, even under the weight of judgment, even in the quiet of loneliness, life bends toward grace for those willing to trust, to care, and to stay.